This podcast is brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tires, batteries, and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. Back in the 1990s, I had a job in industry which required me to visit regularly the Commission and the Parliament of the European Union in Brussels, and from time to time in Strasbourg, as the Parliament moved between those two cities. It still moves between those two cities. It was there that I first heard the description of Switzerland as the hole in the doughnut. That was novel to me. I'd never heard that expression before, but when my hosts showed me their map of the EU with the white space in the middle, I could see why. Of course, the EU was smaller then than it is today, but the picture is still powerful. Today, I'm privileged to be in the company of the European Union's Ambassador to the Swiss Confederation and Liechtenstein, His Excellency Mr. Petros Mavromichalis, and I'm in his embassy office in Bern, which is Switzerland's capital. Ambassador Mavromichalis, welcome to the McKay interview. Thank you for inviting me to your office and for making time for me and listeners to my program.
Thank you for being here.
It's good to meet you again. Ambassador, before we begin, I should mention to our listeners that we could not be in better hands today for a discussion about the EU and, of course, Switzerland, because from what I've read about you, your long career, going back at least 30 years with the EU, has been spent in departments specializing in trade, in enlargement, in policy and foreign relations. And I really would like your help so that I can better understand some of the special peculiarities of the relationship between the EU and Switzerland. And if there's time, we can talk about some of the other wider issues in Europe today. So to begin with, please explain the status of discussions or negotiations, whichever word you use, between the EU and Switzerland. Where are the matters right now? And from the EU Commission's point of view, what is the objective?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's a question which will require me to go a little bit back in time. You mentioned the 90s, and that is the time when, after the end of the Cold War, or so we thought at the time, all the countries in Europe which were not part of the EU or NATO were redefining their position vis-à-vis these two organizations, and certainly the EU, and Switzerland was no exception. And at the time, Commission President Delors had devised the project of the European Economic Area, which was supposed to enable the participation of non-EU member countries to the internal market without becoming members, if you want a sort of associate membership, halfway house, economic membership, call it what you want. And Switzerland, which as a neutral country did not want to belong to a political organization, was very much interested in this project. But as often happens in Switzerland, the treaty that had been signed failed to pass the referendum, the public vote.
I remember I was living here at the time.
Yes, it was on the 6th of December 1992. So how many years ago?
Over 30 years.
32 years ago, almost to the day. And so that caused a certain amount of embarrassment, it's fair to say, in Switzerland. And the Swiss asked the EU, the Commission, for help. Help us so that we can participate in the internal market, help us find a solution, a provisional solution, until we are able to become members of the EU or the EEA. Because what you need to know is that Switzerland had filed a membership request before that referendum.
Could you just explain, Ambassador, before you go further, for the benefit of people maybe listening outside of Switzerland, what is the EEA, please?
the European Economic Area is actually an agreement which enables countries that are European countries, European democracies, countries that share our values, it's not open to everyone, enables them to participate in the internal market, and in exchange those countries commit to abide by the rules and regulations of the internal market, and also to contribute to the cohesion of this internal market, meaning help the poorer regions of Europe.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So this is what the Swiss people rejected at the time. But as ultimately they still wanted to join either this EEA or the EU, we tried together with them to find a sort of a stopgap solution. And this stopgap solution came in the form of bilateral sectoral agreements, referred to in Switzerland as the bilaterals, something that the Swiss like and enjoy and seems to correspond to their interests, because they want to maintain this form of relationship, and this is what we are trying to achieve. So you might ask me, so what's the problem? The Swiss like it, why not keep it? Well, because these treaties were supposed to be, as I said, a stopgap solution, a temporary solution. We had not included in some of these treaties a clause that committed Switzerland to abide not only by the rules as they existed in, let's say, 1999, but to take over the EU's legislation as it evolves. And as you can imagine, within 25 years, it has evolved a great deal in some instances.
Doubled in size, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Also, whenever differences occur, we need to be able to find a solution, a sort of an arbitration mechanism, something legally binding. And finally, we want the Swiss to commit, just as Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein does, and of course our member states, to contribute to the cohesion of the internal market. So this is what we've been discussing and negotiating about since, it's fair to say, more or less 2008.
It's a long time.
It is a long time. It is a long time. And we're hoping to be able to reach a successful conclusion of these negotiations in the coming weeks.
So, Ambassador, I had the pleasure of meeting you a few months ago in a debate with some Geneva diplomats and got the impression that you were rather irritated by the Swiss desire to pick and choose. Now, did I read your body language correctly on that evening? And you've had years of experience in negotiations. What are the sticking points in this case with the Swiss? And what is it that they want, which the EU finds difficult to concede? And as much as you can discuss sensitive negotiating points in public, in the public forum of a radio interview, what are your red lines, and how far would the EU go to give the Swiss what they want, and what would the EU want in return? I'm just curious to understand that equation as it stands.
Well, the differences concern the degree to which Switzerland wants to commit to implementing our future rules, our rules as they evolve. Some people in Switzerland say, well, Switzerland is not a member state of the EU, therefore we decide on our own rules, which is a fair point, you might say.
And they're unknown. These future rules, obviously, yes, by definition, are unknown. Yeah.
Quite right.
Yeah.
But our point is, you want to participate in our internal market, therefore you have to abide by our rules. Where the internal market is concerned, you are of course free to have your own rules in any area not affected by your participation in our internal market, but where you participate, you abide by the rules, just like, I abide by Swiss rules when living in Switzerland. So we think this is also a fair point. So, this principle is what is being haggled about, if you want, and in particular in the area of free movement of people. Switzerland wants to be able to set its own rules as far as, things like admission to the labor market or right of permanent residency, right to expel people who are considered a security hazard, things like that, which are regulated by common EU rules on the internal market, and where we would like Switzerland to align with those rules.
But Ambassador, just can I interrupt, for clarification, that those things aren't covered then by Schengen. That's quite different from Schengen, is it?
Schengen concerns internal controls, which are abolished.
Okay.
Schengen does not concern the right to permanent residence, for instance, or the right to be treated like the nationals of the country where you work in the event that you should become unemployed. Issues like those are not covered by Schengen, but they are covered by our legislation on free movement of people. And we would like Switzerland to abide by those rules, also because the Swiss citizens who live in our countries, and let's not forget there's quite a few of those, there's 450,000 Swiss who live and work in our member states.
450,000, really?
That's
so
5% of the population.
That's considerable.
Yeah. And they enjoy those rights. So we think it fair that our citizens should enjoy those same rights in Switzerland. So this is the kind of things we're discussing. And you asked, what are the sticking points? I mean, for instance, there is this issue that Switzerland wants to be able to unilaterally trigger a safeguard clause, meaning that it can close its labor market to our citizens. And I would like to recall, for the benefit of your audience, that we already have such a safeguard clause in the existing agreement, which says that in the event of serious economic or social hardship, any of the parties can request to invoke to trigger this safeguard clause, and then we need to discuss about it. And my question is, why has this never been invoked?
And is there a time frame? I mean, this can't go on ad infinitum. At some point, parties have to say, "Come on, guys, so let's just stop or conclude." I mean, what's the
negotiations?
Time? Yeah, what's the time frame?
No, but let me finish on this issue of the safeguard clause, which already exists, because you say you've been in Switzerland since the
1984.
1984.
Yeah.
So this agreement came into force after 1999, so sometime in 2000, 2001. Yeah. Have you ever witnessed serious economic or social hardship in Switzerland caused by the presence of EU workers?
Well, I couldn't be as specific as that, but I remember I was living in the German part of Switzerland in the economic crisis of 91, and that was quite difficult for a lot of companies. A lot of companies went out of business, including my own company at that time. I was living in the canton of Zug, but I couldn't be so precise as to say it affected EU. I mean, I was...
Precisely, you mentioned 1991. Yeah. Our agreement was signed in 1999 and contributed to the prosperity of Switzerland as we know it today.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, these agreements that we made were precisely a response to the crisis which Switzerland experienced in the 90s.
Yes, it was quite tough.
I'm glad you say that, because a lot of people seem to have forgotten and only see that today Switzerland is doing fine, thank you very much. But it is doing fine also because we have enabled the integration of Switzerland in the internal market, which is a great asset for the Swiss economy and the Swiss people.
Oh, there's no doubt that both sides are trading off each other, particularly if I look at historically the trade between the German-speaking part of Switzerland and Germany, even just 2 or 3 states within Germany, is huge and has been for 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. But anyway, my guest today is, for those who've just tuned in, the Ambassador Petros Mavromichalis, the European Union's ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and we're talking in his office in Bern, which is Switzerland's capital. Can we just talk a little bit about economic growth, Ambassador? EU economic growth, from the numbers I've seen, and correct me if they're wrong, or maybe just too vague, forecast under 1% increase to 1.5% growth for the EU next year. The American growth rate is 2%, just a bit under 2%, rising to 2.5%. If my figures are correct, it's quite dynamic in America. But the question I want to ask you is that sitting in Brussels, how does the Commission set about raising the economic game of a union which is not actually a country? I mean, it's not a political unitary entity, although I understand the concept of a single market. Moreover, one with such great differences of economic performance, language, culture, amongst its citizens in different parts, so that all of its citizens feel better off. How do you pull the reins to get growth up, so to speak?
You are right. We do not have a central government that implements a centralized economic policy, even though most of our countries have a common currency. So this is a problem we've had for some time. And this is the reason why we try to give from Brussels to agree on certain guidelines which should spur growth and development. And we also try to commit to certain common disciplines as far as budgets are concerned, and the way EU funds, because we do have a common budget, are dispersed and used. And so it's not a question of imposing things, but through exchanges, dialogue, trying to find what is best for all of our member states separately and collectively, so that we will be stronger together. I mean, one example that I could mention is the Commission had requested two important statesmen, Mario Draghi, former president of the European Central Bank and former Italian Prime Minister, as well as another former Italian Prime Minister, Enrico Letta, to draw up two reports on the functioning of how to improve the EU's single market, how to strengthen it, and how to boost the competitiveness of the EU through innovation, financial integration, regulatory simplification. And, we now have to implement those proposals that they have made. In the Draghi report, it is suggested that Europe should invest annually around 800 billion euro, or about 5% of EU GDP. That is, a figure that I suppose strikes everybody's mind. How is this going to be done? I mean, obviously it is for governments, elected governments, to decide that. It will probably be a combination of public and private money. Also, completing the EU Capital Market Union would be important to enable capital and savings, which are considerable within the EU, to be channeled where they are most productive. I mean, we are living a difficult period, both Politically, we have 2 wars at our borders, but also economically, low growth, an aging population. I don't want to brush these under the carpet, but, Europe has assets, and we have shown in the recent past that we are able to overcome crisis, and to overcome these crises, we have to act together. We have to remain united.
Absolutely.
United, we are strong.
Absolutely. Maybe it's a bit unfair of me to wrap 2 questions together, but I have in mind 2 things to ask you, and they may be connected, but if you can draw the connection if you wish. Where do you see the untapped potential of the EU? I just wonder if there are any particular actions that member states can take to facilitate this. And I wanted to link that to migration. My question initially was about illegal migration. I'm thinking of refugees and smuggled economic migrants across the southern coast and the southeastern frontiers of the EU. But has this been a difficulty magnified by certain political classes in the EU, that there's a problem with migration, whether illegal or legal? Countries like Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, France are attractive to migrants. But I have the question I wanted to ask you is, what is the EU strategy to deal with migration in general, getting new blood into an aging population in most parts of the EU, and in particular illegal migration, because you've got this huge border or coastline to the south, which is so difficult to police? I'm just curious to know how you see migration.
Migration is a difficult issue, and one with which our countries have struggled for a long time. Of course, when you talk about migration, you have to differentiate between different categories. I mean, first of all, there is what we in the EU call the free movement of people, which is the right that a Polish citizen has to travel to Germany to take up gainful employment.
Yeah.
This is a right
Sure.
ensured by the treaty.
Yeah.
Same as the German can go to Italy to live, work, study. And this, I believe, works well for the benefit of all concerned. It makes our economies more prosperous and more dynamic, enabling a workforce to go where it is most needed. So this, in the EU at least, is no longer contested nowadays. It is widely accepted.
And appreciated.
I'm happy you say that. Then there is economic migration, which I believe people also understand that we need in Europe. We need it because our workforce is aging. The baby boomers are now slowly or not so slowly reaching retirement age, and the generations that will replace them are not so numerous. It's just a fact of life, and it's unlikely to change. So that means that either we become much more competitive, which it would be desirable, but which would be insufficient, or we work until a much later age, which I think a lot of Europeans would not necessarily want, or it means we need to find workforce elsewhere. So migration, again, is needed. But your question concerned illegal migration, and of course nobody will condone illegal acts of any kind.
And
something illegal is illegal.
And it's fanning the flames of populist politicians.
Yes.
Yeah.
So therefore, illegal migration needs to be combated. But as you said, it is difficult, especially for the countries that have maritime borders. They are more difficult to police than land borders. But, we've decided to reinforce those borders, to have a more efficient screening of those who arrive at our borders, and to return to their countries of origin those who don't have a right to stay. Easier said than done, because this is a horrendously complex issue, which I cannot summarize in 3 minutes.
No, I understand.
And there is the added factor that I did not mention of asylum seekers, who should not be confused with migrants.
No, exactly.
A migrant is someone who's looking for a better life, which is totally legitimate. But that person should come if he or she is welcome and if there is a job for them. And then an asylum seeker is someone who is running for his life, someone whose life is in danger. And then, of course, we have a duty as civilized, law-abiding nations to offer them protection based on UN conventions.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. And so these people need to get a fair hearing with a judge to see whether their life is indeed in danger. And if so, then they have a right to stay in Europe.
Well, that's important. Yeah. I just have one more question for you, Ambassador, because I realise that you're a bit pressed for time this afternoon. We can't have a discussion without making some reference to climate change, because the conference COP29 just finished a few days ago in Baku in Azerbaijan, with many, as you know, I'm sure you follow the news, disgruntled comments about what was a large amount of money promised coming from the developing and poorer nations. Many say it's an existential threat, climate change. Other scientists count it as short to medium term climate futures are less extreme in their terms. But give me some examples of how the EU sees this. It's a big player in this area. What is it doing across its 27 member states, and what degree of success is it achieving in its effort to, and I just use the expression, deal with, I won't call it combat because it's such a huge project, but to deal with, to manage the whole issue of climate change. I'm just curious to know how you manage it across 27 nations. 27 sovereign states. How do you see climate change?
Well, I will start by saying that climate change is the quintessential challenge that we are facing, which cannot be solved by one country,
exactly,
or by a group of countries, exactly, or by a continent. It is transnational by essence, and it's no use if I have the cleanest air in my country and the neighbor is polluting, because the air,
just blows
the water,
across.
Everything blows across. So it is a challenge we need to resolve together, and this is why there is this international effort being done, and the conference COP29 you saw a few days ago, which tries to find solution. You mentioned the fact that some people contest the existential nature of this threat. I say you only need to look around and see the more and more extreme phenomena to which we are confronted to see that the threat is real. Of course, everyone is entitled to their opinion, but very often these are not disinterested opinions. May I remind you that for many decades there were so-called scientists or doctors who doubted that smoking was bad for your health. I think history has shown that they were wrong. So the EU is actually doing a lot. We are a pioneer in climate policy, both internally but also at international level. We are legally committed to fighting climate change by shifting to a climate neutral economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050.
Separate from the nation states that constitute the EU. This is a strategy of the EU itself as a body.
Yes, the EU and its member states. The EU. The EU's institutions' emissions are negligible, if you want.
Exactly.
It's,
I just wanted to understand that.
Acting together. We've agreed to this goal. to become the neutral in terms of greenhouse emissions continent by 2050. And I think we're doing well. I can remind you of a few points that in 2008 we had set ourselves the target of reducing our emissions by 20% by 2020 compared to those of 1990. And we actually achieved to cut them by 30% by 2020. And by 2030, we want to achieve a 55% reduction compared to 2050. So we are really pioneers in this area, and we also want to help others, and in particular less developed, less prosperous nations who, let's be fair, have had less of a role in the past in coming to this situation, achieve their goals. So this is why, we are contributing to the financing. We are also the greatest providers of non-reimbursable development assistance, the greatest providers of humanitarian aid. But, let's be fair, I see the criticism we could always do more, or the rich countries could always do more. That's a fair point, but, you alluded to it yourself. The economic situation is difficult right now. Money is tight, so I think we all need to contribute. It is something which is in all of our interest. We should not look to the short term. We have to look a little bit further in the long term. I understand that for some people, when faced with the dilemma, the end of the month or the end of the world, they will tell you, well, I need to pay my bills at the end of the month.
Yeah.
And that is also understandable. We have to do that in a way that protects the most vulnerable. I think no one in our societies should be faced with the dilemma. You either pay your heating bills, or you pay your food bills. The basic necessities of everyone should be covered, and we have to make sure that through a combination of solidarity, but also a contribution from the private sector, we are able to take this forward. I mean, it's in the interest of humanity.
It is, and it's a subject really, I think, maybe another conversation.
Yes.
As to how politicians manage to explain that complexity to people, that there may be a cost on this which will fall on shoulders which would not find that particularly welcome. And it's really a big issue that's going to come up in the next 10, 15 years, if not already. But Ambassador Mavromichalis, we could talk much longer. I know that you've made time in your schedule for me. I thank you for explaining so many of these complicated matters in such a clear way. It's been very helpful to me. My guest today has been Ambassador Petros Mavromichalis, the European Union's ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Mackay. It was a pleasure to have you here today, and I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to continue this interesting discussion.
Thanks for listening to the Mackay Interview podcast, brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tyres, batteries and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. And you can find more podcasts on Anchor FM. Just Google Mackay Interview Anchor FM. Thanks again for listening.